And we're live. Welcome, everybody. Happy Friday. I'm Jason Wilson, the host of Circle Back to You podcast and also CEO of Circle of Friends Club. We have today our friend, the Grief to Gratitude coach, Carol Banens. Welcome to the show, Carol.
Thanks, Jason, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
It's such an honor. In today's landscape with mental health and everything that's going on with
Yeah,
suicide prevention this month,
yeah,
I have the honor to announce that you are one of our speakers at Freedom Fight Expo on September the 20th, 21st, and 22nd. You'll actually be speaking on the 20th,
I
excuse me,
will.
on the Friday. Yes.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
today, for everybody that doesn't know you in our network and on LinkedIn and YouTube and everywhere else,
yeah.
give us some background information about yourself.
Yeah, okay, yes. Nobody really, I think, ever chooses to be a grief coach or a grief counselor. And my husband, Brian, died in 2018. My background is physical therapy. And over the next 3 years, I figured out I needed a change. I just couldn't do physio anymore. And so I went through some iterations of becoming a coach and finally landed on becoming a grief educator and a grief coach because this felt right. Grief was really, really difficult for me. It took me a long time to start moving through it. And I want to help people to move through it better with less difficulty and to know what's normal and not normal. Hence the title today of You're Not Crazy, You're Grieving, because we don't talk about it. So that's where I came from. It came from my own personal experience and knowing that I want to help others to grieve with compassion, with grace, and with understanding. Oh, lost your sound, Jason. You're muted. Can't hear you. Well, there we go. Technology. Can you hear me? Can't hear you. Try now. No, I could keep talking, but I don't know what Jason's saying. So let's wait and see if he comes back to us here. Because I don't know if you can hear me. This is always interesting on a live podcast, isn't it?
Got you now.
There you are. You're there.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
I thought I was going to have to ad
So
lib for the next bit, but that's okay.
that's all right. So I just wanted to say that, I take my hat off to you because that's not easy going through the grieving process and making a transition like that to use what you've
Yeah.
been through to be a blessing to other people. So
Hmm.
I congratulate you on that.
Thank
There's
you.
so many people out there hurting. As a matter of fact, um, a good friend of mine from high school recently died of cancer. And this was
Yeah,
a
I'm so
complete shock to
sorry.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
This was a complete shock to
yeah.
everybody. And, to prepare for this, like the last year of her life, her and her husband traveled for a year
Oh,
and didn't tell
beautiful.
anybody. Yeah, didn't tell anybody anything about the cancer.
Right. So it was a
So they
shock
were,
to everybody else.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
So of
yeah,
course, her husband is going through the grieving process at the moment, along with
yeah,
everybody else. How
yeah.
do you move past this?
I don't, well, I think the easy answer is you don't. And I think that's one of the things we have to learn about grief. When you lose somebody you love, you still love them just because they're not physically there. And I think this is one of the things we have to educate people. You don't get it over, you don't move past. You learn to integrate the grief into your life so that your life can expand around the grief. Because how do you stop loving somebody you loved? You don't. And so we have to learn, how do we carry that grief, that sorrow? How do we allow it to morph almost into a gratitude for the life that they had, the memories that we have, so that we can move on because we're still privileged to have a life. And I think that a way that we can honor our loved ones is to continue living that life. And it's not easy. So that's what I would say. People often say, have you moved? Somebody said this to me at 6 months. They said, have you moved on yet? Are you over your grief? And I'm like, no, I'm not. And I think that can be really challenging for people because the expectation is that there's a time frame for grief, that we will get over it, that we'll get back to normal. And normal isn't normal anymore, and there is no time frame. um, David Kessler, who's a renowned world educator on grief, who I did my grief educator course with, said acute grief, actually, Jason, how long do you think acute grief lasts for when we say acute grief?
I would say what, 3 to 6 months, maybe
Yeah, he says 2 years.
two
Surprising,
years.
right?
Wow.
two,
Yeah.
2 years. And I think that prior to losing Brian, prior to Brian dying, I would have gone, oh yeah, same as you, a few months.
Yeah.
And it took me 4.5 years to even start feeling like myself. But
Hmm.
that's because I didn't have any grief education, which is what we're talking about today. And I think this is part of what comes into why we feel so crazy when we're grieving, because we don't know what to expect. We don't talk about it. Nobody knows about it. We all know we're going to feel sad, of course. But nobody told me that I might have heart palpitations, that I would be out of breath, that the lethargy of grief, it's a thing. It is, you're exhausted. You can hardly get off the sofa. And I remember thinking, what on earth is happening here? And
Hmm.
the reason we have this lethargy, this slowing down, is so that we can start to process the grief. But often we fight it because everyone says, get back to normal, get back to work within 3 to 5 days. And so you fight it, you don't allow it. So we have this feeling of tiredness, inability to think straight. I mean, I couldn't read. I read all the time. I love reading. I was reading journals and newspapers. I couldn't read 2 sentences. And it took
Hmm.
months and months for that to come back. It was a big surprise. Nobody talks about that. Nobody talks really about the emotional roller coaster that you're going through, that you might feel okay and you think, wow, I'm better, because you think you're going to get better. And then all of a
Right.
sudden you slip down again, and you have these moments of feeling better. You have moments of maybe anger, of guilt. And guilt is interesting. David Kessler said, one of the things that we don't like as humans is to feel helpless, to feel out of control, and we'd rather feel guilty. And so we think, well, if only I hadn't let them go through the front door, they'd have been alive. If only I had said goodbye. If only I hadn't argued. If only, all of these things. And we pile on this guilt because it's almost something we can control. And we distance ourselves from really what's happening and the feelings, the terrible feelings of grief. We might have heart palpitations. And this is quite interesting. You might feel like you're having a heart attack. Now, I
Right.
think people, it's real pain. And in fact, there's a syndrome called broken heart syndrome or Takotsubo syndrome. And it's after the Japanese octopus catching pot that has a sort of a big round bowl. And the part of our heart, the left ventricle, expands like that. It stretches like this after grief in some people. And we've heard of maybe an older couple, maybe the husband dies, and 2 weeks later the wife dies, and we say, oh,
Yeah.
she died of a broken heart. Well, she
Right.
might have done. And so I have to tell people, if you are having chest pain, of course, go and have it checked. Have it checked by your doctor. But who knew that that would happen? Um, Gastric indigestion, appetite changes. Some people just, they can't eat. My sister lost
Hmm.
60 pounds. She just couldn't eat. I, on the other hand, could eat, and I ate and comfort ate, my way through my grief. Sleep, insomnia, can you go to sleep? Can you fall asleep but wake up? Do you have nightmares? And this is really difficult because we all know when you've had a bad night's sleep, you never feel good, even when you're not in grief. But if you're in grief as well, and it's tiring to process grief and you're not sleeping, this can really make you feel like you're a little crazy and loopy because you can't think straight. Can't think straight.
Sure.
You know, you don't. Sorry,
Sure.
yeah. You want to ask? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you real quick, if you don't
Mm,
mind, because I know that
mhm,
this, it's still kind of recent, But what were the circumstances of your husband's death? How did he die?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, well, he was a jazz pianist, and for many of his years, of course, he played in smoky jazz clubs, and he smoked, but he gave up a long time ago, and he got lung cancer. And this was in 2012. So we had that 6-year journey of, part of the lung being removed, then the whole lung being removed, then being okay, but then developing tracheal cancer, which was really awful. And what I will say about Brian is, first, he was a wonderful patient. He never complained, but he was a musician. And I think music fed his soul. It gave him a reason to be. He was music. And so he played gigs right up until, the last few months of being ill. But the tracheal cancer was a real, real challenge because it came to the point where he couldn't swallow. His breathing wasn't good and he had to be on oxygen. And we made the decision that was very difficult for him to go into a hospice in the last 2 weeks. And that was a really hard decision for us, and I was in and out of the emergency room with him really every month at least, with something happening, and I just couldn't cope anymore at home. And if anybody is struggling with this decision, I would say for us, I don't know for anyone else because everybody's is different, but it was the best decision because he got the best care, and I could step back from being the caregiver and just be his wife and just spend that time as Carol and Brian rather than what do you need? What do I need to do? And so it was really a very peaceful end, which of course is what he wanted in the best way that we could find for him. So that was our journey. Now, at that time, I was still working full time as a physical therapist. I had a mother who was sick in the UK, so I was going back and forth to her. I had a friend with Alzheimer's. I was emptying his house, and there was a lot going on. So after
Mm.
Brian died and the lethargy of grief hit me, I thought it was just because I was exhausted. I didn't realize I was exhausted and there was the lethargy of grief. And I think this is why grief is so much more complex than we think it is, because everybody's different. Everybody has different life circumstances. We don't know what's going on in their life. We don't know what's been modeled for them about grief in the past. When I was 9, my sister Susie died, and I was in England, and my parents kept calm and carried on. We didn't talk about it. There is no judgment on my part. Now I have much deeper understanding about grief, but that's what people did. We never dealt with it. And so we
Mm.
have past griefs that we haven't dealt with that tap into the grief that we're now trying to deal with. So you have to look at people's own personal health. Were you depressed before? Well, if you already were suffering from anxiety or depression, you can bet that after grief, that's going to be amplified. So it makes grief complicated because it is so individual. Even though we have some similar things that we go through, it is a very individual, personal experience, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And I lost my mom in 2014, and I was at peace with the death because, she was going through a couple of strokes that she had before
Hmm.
she actually passed of an aneurysm.
Right.
But before that point, she lost control of the ability to walk. She couldn't
Yeah.
talk after the second stroke, and I had a conversation with the Lord, and I said, the quality of life is gone. I said, she can't enjoy anything.
Yeah.
I would much rather her to be with you than to
And
be
yeah.
living this kind of existence. So when she died, I was at complete peace with it, but it didn't really hit me. She died in April of
Yeah.
2014.
Yeah.
And then when Mother's Day came in May, it didn't hit me
Uh,
until then that I
yeah.
couldn't pick up the phone and call her. That part was really, really painful, and it took me, I would say, a good 6 months to get used to the fact that she wasn't around.
Yeah, isn't it an interesting thing? Again, there we go. We grieve differently. Some people
Yep.
fall to pieces straight away, some don't. Some it's delayed, like you, until one of these special moments, like, oh, I can't call mum to say happy Mother's Day or happy birthday or happy Christmas. Or I used to phone my mother every day from Canada to the UK, and she died unfortunately of COVID during COVID when there were no planes. Nobody could be with her. It was heartbreaking.
Mm,
And yet, you know, as you say, sometimes even though we are in anticipatory grief, which is when you know somebody's going to die, you're in that anticipation stage like you were, and I was with Brian, I just didn't know it. Um, and I was, and this is interesting to me. I'm very pragmatic. He also didn't have a quality of life. If he couldn't breathe, if he couldn't play the piano, what sort of life was there for him? None. And yet, after he died, even though I knew it was better for him, and even though I was prepared, I wasn't prepared. I wasn't prepared for all these things that made me feel like I was going a little bit nutty. It's because we don't talk about it. We don't know that we're going to have these feelings. We don't know we're going to have these physiological effects. I mean, pains that you perhaps haven't had for years. All of a sudden, your old shoulder pain starts aching, or other pains that you have are amplified. We don't know about this. So as we talk about it, and if somebody's grieving, I want you to know you're not going crazy. You are just grieving. You're feeling one of the many things. You know, it's a whole body experience. I think if we can understand that about grief, it's not just this emotional heartbreak. There's the physiology of what happens. And quite often, um, especially a spouse, if they die, people say, I feel like I've lost half of me, or I feel like I've had an amputation.
mm,
And that's so interesting, isn't it? Well, you know, there's a wonderful book called The Grieving Brain by Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. And she talks about how our partners, our loved ones, are actually encoded in our neurons. And so when they're gone, you feel like you've lost a part of them. But in a sense, they're always with you, which I find comforting because they're always there. And yet, what happens is we start to search for them. We have yearning. Early on in grief, we may go, I know they're dead, but I wish they were here. If only they were here. And you just ruminate and you go over and over and you wish and you wish. And of course, early on, we do that, but we need to move through that and come to a place of acceptance that they aren't coming back. Because if you keep on with the yearning, and of course, it's not really a conscious thing, it can lead to more complicated grief or depression because you're just not able to come to a place of acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean you like what happened, it just means you're accepting the fact that it's happened. I think that's important because we think of acceptance, we're thinking, I'm okay with it. Well, you're not okay that somebody you love isn't there, but you're
right.
okay in the sense you understand that they're not there. It's very different.
Yes. So Dr. D'Angelo Richardson is in the audience. He says this is an amazing dialogue, and during a grieving period, he laid in bed, locked in a room for 3 weeks, no food, no
Yeah.
communication, and he felt dead.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And you know, again, you know, when you're in grief, I totally resonate with that. I you want to put I you know, I wrote a poetry book, and one of them talks about pulling the covers over your head, being in a cocoon, hoping you never have to get out of it. And if you pop your head out, that maybe they'll be next to you. And sometimes when I talk about grieving, we have to be an active participant in our grief. What I mean by that is not just waiting for time and hoping that everything sorts itself out, but it might just be getting out of bed. It
Mm,
might be having a shower. As we do these things, you know, we start to actively grieve. But yes, it's so profound, it can shut you down. It's very,
absolutely.
yeah, it is. It really is that whole body. You feel leaden, you can't move. That was me. And again, some other people try and cover up their grief by getting busy because they just don't want to feel what has happened. So they get very, very busy
Mm,
and put off feeling it because it still comes, it's going to come back. At some point, it is going to come back. It will stay in the body. And here's a statistic for you. 10% of psychiatric illnesses have been attributed to unresolved grief. This is why it's so important for us to talk about it, for us to learn how to self-soothe our nervous system, how to deal with our emotions so that they don't stay stuck in our body, causing us mental health issues later on, physical issues, aches and pains, migraines, all of these things. So grief is a lot more complex, I think, than we ever thought. And yet it's a normal, natural process. We all know, we all know it's going to happen to us. We never want it to. That's why we don't talk
Right.
about it, right? But at some point it is. And grief is any significant loss. And we're specifically talking about death here. But of course, it can be a divorce. It can be moving country, as I did. It can be pet loss. It can be loss of quality of life. My patients, when I was in physiotherapy, some of them were in such chronic pain, they lost their job. Another grief, right? So there are many, many types of grief, but we're specifically really talking about death here.
Well, a question that I have, Carol, and we get to Neil
Mm.
Jacobs, our lovely friend, um, is that when you're going through these terrible feelings, what stops people from talking about them when it comes to a death?
Yeah, well, they're embarrassed. Nobody, I think because we've never talked about it. You don't know, some people can be open and listen. And so you pick who you talk about it, but you're never sure. And you feel like you should be doing it better. You think, well, I should be okay. I knew it was, for example, I knew it was going to happen. I should be fine. I went back to work 3 days after my husband's funeral. Dumb.
Did you?
Yeah, I did. Stupid, right? That's why I burnt out. But I didn't know that because I thought you just keep going. So talking about grief to people, some people don't want to hear it. Some people can't deal with your pain. They love you so much. They want to make you feel better. And so they aren't able to allow you to express the very deep hurt that you're feeling because it makes them feel uncomfortable. And so they just want to kind of chivvy you along. I think that's probably English, but make you feel better, fix you, come on, smile. What can we do to make you feel better? Well, actually, what you can do is sit quietly with me and say nothing and listen. Go for a walk with me. And that's why it is so important for somebody in grief to find somebody, whether that's a coach like me, a grief educator, a therapist, maybe a spiritual advisor, or a dear friend that can cope with this, someone you can talk to, because we have to talk about it. As we talk about it, we're processing it, and our brain is getting used to the fact that, oh, this person really isn't coming back. But we
Mm,
can't shove it down. And I think it's embarrassment, it's discomfort on the griever's part, because mostly people will say, how are you? Well, if you're a griever, you're very sensitive and you want to say, how do you think I am? But
right.
mostly people will say, I'm fine. They don't go into it. It's only a few people that you can really let that out with and know that they can hold it, because holding somebody else's grief is not an easy ask. It isn't.
No,
So
absolutely
I
not.
think it's embarrassment for self. I think it's knowing that you might cause discomfort somewhere else and knowing that they can't maybe cope with it. Did that answer your
Oh,
question?
yeah, yeah, that was a wonderful answer. Okay, so from Tanil, what wonderful work you do, Carol. I know your work focuses on the surviving spouse. Do you have
Yeah.
tips on how to support grieving children who have lost a parent? Often children are
Ooh,
overlooked in these situations. Yeah, they are.
they absolutely are, aren't they? There's, I think we tend to try and sugarcoat things for children. And from my reading, I haven't actually had to deal with this, but from the reading and the education I've had is be as truthful as you can with children. Don't say mummy's gone to sleep. Why not?
Mm,
Because then children are scared of going to sleep because mummy went to sleep and she never came back. So they might think, oh my gosh, if I go to sleep, um, you know, I might not wake up. So I think you've got to try and be as honest as you can with the age that they're at. Another thing, I think people are concerned about funerals. Do you take a child to a funeral? And again, from reading, yeah, right. I think yes would, but it's personal choice, but it would be a yes, but have somebody else with them that can be with them depending on their age. So if you are the grieving spouse of somebody who's died, you're in your own grief and you're trying to deal with your child's grief. Have a really dear friend who can be with that child. If they're a little child, make sure they go to the washroom. Do they need to go out? Do they just want to say goodbye? Can they sit at the back? All of these things to support the children, but I think being very open about it. Now, my son is my son from my first husband, not from Brian. And I have been but he was close to Brian. We lived together. And I've been very open about talking about Brian. So I'd say, wouldn't Brian have loved this, or wouldn't he have laughed at that? Because I want him to know that it's not taboo to talk about them. So I think with children, you can do things like creating a photo album or a memory book, or taking time to really honor that, mummy or daddy on their birthday. Could we write them a card? Or Christmas, making a Christmas, or have them involved and try and speak to them at whatever age appropriate level you can, about honestly. And then as they grow up, you can fill them in with more details. I hope that helps.
I think that's great advice. And children can be actually traumatized from attending a funeral. That actually happened to me, and I didn't realize it was trauma until a few months ago. But
Interesting.
to
What
this
was
day,
what
go
was
ahead.
traumatizing for you? What was it? Do you remember? Do you even know?
Well, I was about 9 years old when I went to this funeral, and I just remember it was actually my great grandfather that died.
Yeah.
And so, prior to the funeral, I didn't even have the chance to meet him. But once I
Oh,
saw him lying, yeah, yeah, I didn't know who he was. And
right.
so when I saw him in the coffin, it was an open casket at
Yeah.
the funeral,
Yeah.
and I had never experienced this before. And I mean, I was scared
Of
and
course.
traumatized by it. And there was really nobody that I could go to talk to about what I was feeling. And so I
I
guess my subconscious buried it for all these
I'm sure.
years.
Yeah.
And
So that brings up
yeah,
I I was going to say that brings up a good point. It's about preparation, isn't it? So, for example, if you
sure.
are taking a child to a funeral, tell them what to expect. In England, we didn't really have open coffins more recently. I think in the past they used to have, grandma or grandma in the front room with an open casket until the time of the funeral. But we've sort of sanitized grief a lot. And I can remember being here as an adult, going to my first wake and seeing an open casket. And I have to say, it was very upsetting for me. It was something I I hadn't experienced. So I can imagine as a
Right.
9-year-old not knowing who it was, not knowing anything about it. And I think these are the things we have to be honest with the children and talk to them. And maybe if it's an open casket, you don't take the child up to that, if that's,
Mm,
or you can take them up to say goodbye. But you can tell them that the body, you say, grandma's body isn't working anymore. It got sick. It stopped working. You can talk about it in terms that a child will understand. But we
yes, that's
remember
great.
grandma by, or we remember daddy by this, because daddy always lives in your heart. I mean, I'm very much a heart focused person. So for me, the memories are what keep our person alive. Physically, again, I wrote a poem, physically, you're not here, but spiritually. And I know we are spiritual. So I believe that there is something more. But I think if you don't, you can really take comfort in knowing that your loved one is encoded in your brain. So they're always with you. They're always with you. The memories are always lit with you. So we don't have to lose connection. And I think if you can really encourage children to keep a connection in different ways, in honoring them, in talking about them, I think that demystifies grief for them and makes them more comfortable with it.
Wow. There are so many people that need to hear this information. I'm so glad you're on the show to talk about this,
I'm
Carol.
so happy to be
Another
here.
comment from yes. So from Maria Simonetti, great conversation and needed absolutely.
Thank you.
Um, Gosh, it seems like more people are dying now from accidents, from unforeseen diseases and other things. So this information is so needed. Another
Good,
comment from
good.
Tanil. What wonderful ideas. I have a niece and nephew who lost their mom. They do open up to me about their experience, and sure enough, their feelings were often dismissed after the death of their mom. They also had not had much opportunity to remember their mom. They were 3 and 7 or thereabout when she died. The one who was 7 at the time is still struggling with it, even though it was almost 11 years now since their mom passed. Wow. This year we'll be celebrating their mom.
Oh, you've frozen. I don't know if I've frozen, but
Finish that
we are.
thought. To She has to finish her thought, but what do you think
Yeah,
about that up until this
y-
point, Carol?
yeah. I just want to say something came up for me. You know, that the reason we have to be as honest as we can with children is because they fill in the facts or what they think has happened, and often it's much worse than the truth. So that's one of the things we do need to be as honest. Yeah, I mean, it's never too late to grieve. It's never too late to say, you know, you were very young. I'm just reading this here. You know, you were very
Mm,
young when your mummy died. Do you remember your mummy? Let's look at some photos. Wow. Did you know she did this? Start telling stories. How would you maybe like to celebrate her or honor her on this year of her death, on this anniversary? What could we do that might be nice for your mummy? Do you want to take flowers to her grave? Do you want to write a poem about her? Do you want to, you know, make a craft for her, light a candle for her? There are lots of ways we can start to really do it, but I think it begins with talking. I think it begins with opening up to the emotions. And how do you feel without your mummy? What do you think you miss about her? What would you like to tell her? Maybe what have you done this year that you would have told your mother about? It's 11 years. So he was 7, so he's about 18. Would that make it right? You know, you've gone through
right.
your whole teenage years without mum being at your graduation ceremony. All the things mum is going to miss out on, and you're going to miss having your mum there at graduation, marriage, all of these things, first children. We grieve that too. So, how can you build a relationship with somebody who's gone? Keep that connection so that they're still with you. I think that's important.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Hmm.
Another comment from Maria. Whether you expect it or not, grief comes in waves, and it's a process of knowing who you are without that person. The heart and head are not in agreement that the person may be gone. It's natural people want to see you feeling better and get back to being your old self. But in reality, that old self had that person in their lives. So it's you who,
Yes, who are becoming
so
now.
it's
So
you.
true.
Yeah.
This is so true. And this, I think, this really, well, a couple of things. The grief comes in waves. There's something called grief bursts that I meant to mention. You know, you can be driving along and all of a sudden grief hits you for no apparent reason. You might have to pull off to the side of the road. That happened to me so often. Or you get a scent of a perfume or a piece of music, particularly for me, music, because Brian was a musician. Every song made me cry, couldn't listen to his CDs. So we get these
Wow.
bursts or waves of grief that wash over us, and they're often at the beginning, and they can be embarrassing. You might be somewhere and all of a sudden you burst out crying and people think, oh gosh, what's wrong with her? It's a grief burst. Now, are you comfortable enough to put your hand on them and say, I'll be okay in a minute? Or do you need to go off to the washroom and just kind of hide for a moment? So they come less often and less severely as grief goes on. But listen, I'm at 6 years and it still happens to me. I'm just going to say, yes, your old self. Life isn't normal after your loved one's gone, and you're not normal. So when people talk about, oh, let's get back, are you back to normal yet? The answer is no, my normal is different now. And it's a discovery process. You know, when I work with people with my Choose program, one of them is seeking a new self identity, because who are you now that you're not a mother, a father, a son, a daughter, whoever it is? Your role may have changed. And if you've been married for 30, 40, 50 years, you were a we do this, we do that, rather than I, and you've gone from this couple, this we, back to being I, and you have to discover, who is that person now? Who do you want to be? What do you want to bring forward from before? What is there that's new that might actually give you meaning and purpose? It's really reclaiming your life and rediscovering yourself. And that's work. That's the grief work.
Absolutely. Wow. This has been so helpful, Carol. I cannot wait until future episodes. We'll
We
actually
have.
be back. Yeah, we'll be back for the next episode. But before we go, I want to give
Mhm.
everybody your website to get in touch
Yep.
with you. So carolbanenseveryone.com. Where else can people find you, Carol?
Yep, you can go to YouTube with my name. I've got lots of little short 2 to 5 minute videos on anticipatory grief, gracing grief, all sorts of things on grief there. So please go there. If you go to my website, you can download a easier grief burst meditation, some coping tips. I'm on LinkedIn, obviously. I'm on Facebook. I'm sort of on Instagram, but mainly LinkedIn, YouTube, my website. Oh, and my book, of course. I've got a book, Kintsugi Your Heart, The Art of Living with Grief, which is all grief poetry. Perhaps next time we will read one.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason,
Awesome.
for allowing me to have this conversation about grief. It's so important, and I really
Yeah.
appreciate you opening this up for people.
Sure, absolutely. It's a pleasure. Everybody, Carol Banens, we will be back next week. Everybody have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye bye.